talking about sports writing, the books of George Plimpton. George Plimpton was a writer from the early 50s until the early aughts and a co-founder of the Paris Review, one of the more important outlets for literary fiction in the last 70 years in U.S. literature. Uh, he wrote 7 books about sports, most of which contain the same hook, and the hook is that Plimpton himself competes on the field with, professional athletes. It was a very effective hook. The first use of it was in the 50s. He during an exhibition game, he attempted to pitch to the entire American League all-star lineup. You get the impression from Plimpton that he was a fine, amateur athlete and in decent shape, so he, could do this, but just not at the professional level. And that didn't go too well for him. He wrote a book about Hank Aaron's seeking the career home run record, which he eventually broke in 1974, I believe. And he wrote a book about golf, where he attempts to play in some of the PGA tournament games. He wrote a book about hockey, where he donned the goalie mask and again, as a sort of exhibition, tried to defend the net from professional hockey players for I think it was 3 minutes. He donned he boxed. His book about boxing is one of his best. The part where he himself boxes is only a small part of it. And the rest he talks about, he writes about Muhammad Ali, especially his fight with George Foreman in Zaire, the fight known as the Rumble in the Jungle. But part of the book he does do a round in the ring with a great boxer named Archie Moore, who at one time was the light heavyweight champion of the world. And he describes what it's like being hit by one of the greatest boxers in the world. And he wrote 2 books about football, which are probably his best known sports books. Probably his best known book overall is one of his books on football called Paper Lion, where he spends spring training with the Detroit Lions in 1963, 64, something like that. And he tries out as a quarterback for the Lions roster. At first there's some mild attempt at keeping this hidden from the rest of the team, and only the management know that he's just kind of a writer there collecting material for a book, but that quickly kind of breaks down, and it just becomes known that he's becomes clear he's not any kind of professional athlete. In that one, he spends the most overall time with these athletes, and so it comes out as the best book. In the others, you get the impression that this was a fairly short amount of time that he spent exploring the world of these sports. But in spring training, he was there, I think it must have been for at least a month, working out with these athletes and really spending time with them, and learning their jokes and their styles and learning about them as people. And his the books are clearly written, well written. They include personal elements from Plimpton. He's a very good storyteller. He puts you in a scene very well, so the books are a nice mix of dramatic moments with reconstructed dialogue, and then these kind of general speculations about the sport, things that Plimpton's noticed. Like in the Paper Lion book, for example, he notices that athletes on the Lions football players are better at cursing than he is. He feels a little silly about this, but he says it's just not very natural to him. So at one point, when he doesn't make a play that he'd hoped to make, he goes, "Oh shoot," and the other athletes sort of laugh and "Oh wow, George is really angry now. Everybody calm down. Don't mess with George. He's really mad," because of course they're flinging the curses around pretty freely. And he also has a good bit in one of the books, the football book again, I think, where he talks about how there are some people who really just enjoy physical contact with other people, hard physical contact even, like bumping and bruising, and that if you're a football player, this is a good thing to enjoy because it's, it's a big part of your job. And so if you're just one of these people to whom it comes to naturally as something that you can take a certain amount of pleasure, and if it just feels like the way you want to live and how you want to live with your body, so that, like, the sweat and the bruises and the hitting and the clock, if that all just kind of, like, on some level is just sort of, like, basically desirable to you, then you might have what it takes to be a pro footballer. He does not claim to have this quality himself, but I thought it was, pithily observed and well written. But what makes Plimpton's sports books, I have two observations to make about them in the sort of general tone of, like, of books about sports, and how, books writing about sports takes on, different forms. So if the Zane Grey described earlier was sort of a baseball sports romance in sort of the pre-World War I romantic tradition, and if Ring Lardner's was sort of like sports as the setting for, like, the human comedy and, sort of joking, ironical tales, John Tunis's sports novels are sort of serious moral tales of self-improvement, George Plimpton's are are sort of like the participant observation. He certainly wasn't the first person to do this, but he was pretty good at it and did it pretty well. And it was this, the peek behind the scenes, the parts of the sport and the things that go into what you observe as a spectator, but that you're not aware of, or if you are, you're not usually aware of them from the point of view of the athlete. The stuff that happens, before the game, after the game, off season, when just, a few people on the team are around. This was almost like harmless muckraking, if you will. Muckraking, being the sort of journalistic tradition in the U.S. that started around 1900 of looking around for the behavior of an institution or a corporation or a government or a person that they kind of don't want publicized, that happen but that they don't go out of the way to share with people. This Plimpton's stuff is something like that, and what makes it charming instead of threatening is that he's a very seemingly genial man who could get along easily with lots of different kinds of people, and he's generally sort of sunny and optimistic and presents things in a generally under the assumption that people are sort of trying to do their best. An example of this might be in the second of his football books, which I think was called Mad Ducks and Bears. It develops more of the material from Paper Line because he stayed friends with these guys and he learned more about their world. But at one point he attends a players' union dinner. By this point the football players have a union of sorts, but it's not like the high-paid salaries that modern athletes can command. The big money hadn't quite come through in football yet, but they do negotiate and support. And Plimpton learns that there's a gathering nearby of former football players, some of them real stars who the players of today admired and even idolized, and that these sort of veterans of the football leagues are trying to get better benefits from the owners and the league generally. They're trying to get a little more support. These are guys who would have played in like the 30s and the 40s when the sport was really not making a lot of money, and they would have played for not very much, but of course their work did build the excitement and the fan base that the current players are benefiting from. So he goes back to the current players and he tells them that there's these people over there, and he said there's just this tremendous disinterest in these guys and what they're trying to do. And he was like, you guys, if you pushed the owners, you could probably get them to include the veterans in some of the benefit improvements and the increased salaries that you guys are getting now. They would probably take that on. Why Why don't you try to help them share? And no one really takes them up on it. No one really turns them down. They ask a few questions and then they just kind of let it drop. Now, a more scathing, writer in the sort of more the full muckraking spirit of like Ida Tarbell and Lincoln Steffens could have presented this as a real moment of sort of moral cowardice on the part of the current players not stepping up, or perhaps a forgetting of what they owe, how the players who they could have a chance to help now were the ones who like built the league that they were able to enter into. But Plimpton doesn't do that. He's a little, I think he's just too reluctant to hold people to that kind of standard in his writing, and he generally presents everyone in his books very sunnily. He likes the sort of the lighter side. So he does not ignore moments like this, but he doesn't, through his writing, push the reader to develop any particular conclusion. Now that can be very effective at getting a message across without having to say it directly. Not a lot of people do not like to be hectored, and the sort of the Ida Tarbell method of just saying, oh, isn't this awful, these guys won't stand up for the people who built their league and help them out now that they're like middle-aged or old men and they really could use, a lot of people don't respond to that, but your message is clear. But the Plimpton method, of course, can indirectly, get the message across and leave the reader with an appreciation of the situation that, maybe will resonate with them. But I don't think that's what he's trying to do here. I think George in his many other sports books, I think George Plimpton just wants he wants the face of sports to be sort of like clean and bright. He doesn't mind showing the other sides of it. He shows some behavior on the parts of the players in other books, as well as the football ones, that is not like ideal human behavior. Maybe it's like impish or misunderstanding, or kind of like just not very attractive. But I think in general he wants things to be be as they seem. Star players who generally in their way are pursuing a common good, and are, if they can do well by themselves on the way, but in general like doing something good together, like building up a sport, building up a league, creating excitement and entertainment for their country, this sort of thing. And this leads me to two other things, which is fundamentally, I think, Plimpton's sports writing is very respectful of authority, which the authors have talked about previously for sports writing can be, but not in quite the same way. Zane Grey's sort of sports romance writing is respectful of authority, but in the manner of like a sleepwalker, where they can't really imagine not just kind of following the rules and falling in love with a girl and shaking the mayor's hand and this sort of thing. Ring Lardner is not super respectful of authority. He's not a rebel against authority. His is more the attitude of like, oh, what fools these mortals be, including the people who supposedly have power and wisdom, but they don't, and really nobody does, but that's okay. There's no fixing it, which is a very common attitude for comedic writers generally. John Tunis is respectful of authority. His fiction is generally respectful of authority in the but also within a kind of universe where people are mostly thrown on their own devices and left to figure things out for themselves. So his characters are often put in the position of taking, having to do like self-discovery and negotiate difficult situations, having to take risks, having to sacrifice, but they don't really question the overall structures that they exist within. They just want to succeed within them and find the limits during which success is possible. Plimpton is a good enough writer and a broad enough, curious person to be aware of the structures that guide these sports and that sort of structure the attitudes of these athletes' lives. And he doesn't, he doesn't uncritically approve of them. I think at this time he looked at these things critically and he found them to be good. Critical thinking and critical analysis does not automatically mean finding the negative sides of things. I think he just was really happy with sports and how they were working to sort of dazzle people with talent and human skill and ambition and teamwork and so on. And if he noticed certain things along the way, like the quirks of players or some of the kind of hazing rituals that go on in spring training, or how golfers are not always very congenial to each other, that didn't shift his overall perspective. I think he just thought things were going really well. And you notice that the era in which he was writing these books, I think the first one came out in about 1958, and the last one sometime in the late 70s. These were kind of peak years for sort of U.S. Establishment attitudes and the U.S. Sort of position in the world at large. World War II had ended. The U.S. was left in the position of being almost the only large economic power that hadn't, suffered catastrophic damage during the war. I've read estimates something like 60% of the world's assets at the end of World War II were in the U.S. Of course, and then through the Cold War, U.S. influence and trade extended all over the world, and people all over the world got to experience U.S. culture through like movies and Coca-Cola and rock and roll tours and just all sorts of things. The U.S. came out to the world in a way that it never had before. And Plimpton was very much of this world. He came from a fairly establishment family background. When he co-founded the Paris Review, it was discovered many years later, they partly used money from the CIA as part of the CIA's efforts to sort of keep American culture from being radicalized by socialist or communist ideas. The idea was to create these sort of like strong mainstream cultural institutions that would resist the kind of socialist inspired, or at least socialist adjacent ideas that were really common in the U.S. during the 20s and 30s. And so the Paris Review was meant to be part of this effort, and Plimpton almost certainly knew about this from the beginning. Certainly, he edited the review for a long time. It's very difficult to believe he didn't experience part of this. But again, I think he just thought it was fine. When this started, the United States felt good about itself and its institutions, and some of the institutions that it felt really good about were its sporting institutions, because sports have tremendous cultural power to cross over barriers that other cultural institutions sort of run up against. Sports can reach people who don't all speak the same language, literally. Sports can reach people of like all ages, unite them around common experience, and through the medium of television, which really was getting big by like 53, 54. Mark Bowden, in one of his books, makes the case that football really started becoming like the national game on TV starting around 1958, as the camera work expanded and the quality of the picture got better, and it became apparent that football was a game you could really watch the whole game on TV in a way that wasn't possible with some of these others. So you imagine Plimpton's books beginning in this TV sports era and trying to offer something different than just TV spectation can offer. So you come up with this idea of, I will participate directly in the sports and I will describe it to people, which is something that TV wasn't as good at back then. I would say it's better now because we have so many more cameras, floating across the place, and so it's much easier to like zoom in and put the people in the. But if you imagine back then when cameras were like black and white and tended to be fixed and to just show a couple of shots, you can imagine the role for kind of Plimpton's books where he's going to expose what the cameras aren't able to show to you through his writing. I think I said fiction earlier, but I meant writing. These books are nonfiction. Um, so, in responding to a very common thing that happens in human life to people at certain points is they get curious whether the things that they're seeing and the institutions that they are participating in on some level really are as they seem. As life goes on and as you yourself, participate deeper and grow into different human institutions and attitudes, you become aware, if you have any bent towards this, that part of your work and part of your role in these is sort of presenting a face to the rest of your society. Using good language, stressing the elements of your institution that have wide appeal. And although it would be hard to stay in an institution where the face doesn't match, what's really going on at all, most people are aware that the face doesn't fully match what's really going on. That sometimes the reasons why things are done are not the reasons exactly fully shared, or not the reasons emphasized in public. And as this goes on, we become curious about what that's like for other groups that maybe we interact with or are curious about or love, like sports, but that we don't have direct experience. We don't know what's really going on, quote unquote, behind the scenes, and we want to know, how much does what's happening, what the face of this institution, how much does it match the rest of it? Is the face a fair representation? We can understand little details, we can understand even the occasional kind of large open secret, but we want to know the values. If the values presented on the face are roughly the values that guide the operations institution, I think in general you could say a lot of people are satisfied. If they find out that the values the institution has in its face are not the values at all that guide its operations, they're going to be very upset. A classic example of this, again from sports, is probably the long debate over TV wrestling, over how much of it was real and how much of it was not. TV wrestling, I have read, I have not confirmed, was one of the first TV programs to actually make a profit through advertising. It's very cheap to show, and it was very popular. So this is going back to like the late 1940s, even before that explosion of television purchasing in the early 50s. TV wrestling was already solid, and of course now we sort of know, these multiple leagues and championships, and becoming a wrestler sometimes seems like one of the best ways to become a celebrity in the United States, and so on and so on. So the debate over whether it's real conditions, what the values of the sport are. And in the early days, of course, wrestlers wanted to present things very much as real, because they thought that was the appeal part of the appeal of the sport, was to believe that the competition part is real. As time went on and the audience kind of shifted and grew, it became apparent that the audience was mostly okay with the idea of wrestling as pure spectacle, and they respect the skill involved in the spectacle without needing to believe that it was like a direct athletic competition in the same way. And as little bits and pieces of people's memoirs and stories came out, the conversation shifted now to where people would say, something like, pro wrestling is real entertainment, or it's difficult and it is a skill. The fact that they roughly are working together to present entertainment doesn't mean it's not challenging and that it's not athletic. It's a conversation that other people know better than I do. But I think it does fit this model I've suggested, in which I think Plimpton was working in, which is, let's look at what's really going on behind the scenes and see if it matches the values presented on the front. And I think when it came to his sports writing, George Plimpton thought that the values going on behind the scene pretty much matched those on the front. That the label fit what was in the jar. And I also think that this was a really common attitude among U.S. culture makers, cultural commentators in the 50s, 60s, and 70s when Plimpton was writing his sports books. It was this attitude that there are problems, there are quirks, people aren't always savory, but basically the decent, caring, noble institutions that we have built do represent and do work towards along the values that they present. You know, hospitals are about making people better. Governments are about representing the needs of the people. Businesses are about making good products that other people can afford. And although there might be the occasional reprobate or rotten apple spoiling a barrel, and even occasionally a major problem because, there was like some institutional gap in authority, but that generally things were going okay, and the people growing into the institutions were motivated by what we might wish them to be motivated by, and were, producing the kinds of culture and art and policies and values and families and everything in the manner that sort of best suited the country. George Plimpton stopped writing these sports books in, I think it was 1980. I think the last one was the one on hockey. And I think that's not totally a coincidence, because starting in the 80s, perhaps, going all along with this, all along, there was always some sort of undercurrents of deeper criticism and the deeper spirit of muckraking, of really sort of digging into things. But by the time 1980 rolled around, it really became the dominant tone of the culture, which was the expose. So I'd like to suggest that George Plimpton's sports books were kind of like one of the major cultural works that was not based on the expose, the idea that, the way things really work is at odds with the face of the institution. And there are all sorts of exposés of all sorts of institutions, and it's become so common in our nonfiction and our journalism, such a standard trope, even in genres that you might not think would really be suited to exposés. It's really become one of the automatic ways in which Americans interpret their own society, is the assumption that if we pulled back on a curtain, we might find something shocking or disturbing, or at least weird, at odds with what the thing seems to be for. And this is such a common assumption across so many fields and across, other divisions, left, right, so on. I think it's really neat to look back and see a body of work that looks like an expose, but then found nothing shocking to expose.